Suzanne, it's so great that you can join us for this virtual interview with us all inside. And I'm hoping that we could start by your telling us a little bit about your research and also about the focus of the work you did at the Alnarp Landscape Lab.
Sure. So my work primarily focuses on looking at how microclimatic factors define space in the landscape. Things like light, shade, wind, and temperature. These are all elements that we can sense with our bodies, and they change the way that we perceive enclosure when we're outside.
That's so interesting because the Landscape Lab has always struck me as this place that has these enclosures outside, which are kind of rooms outside.
Exactly.
And so maybe you could also tell us a little bit about the fieldwork process or method that you use to make these kinds of measurements or when you do this research and what you did at the Landscape Lab.
So in my work, I actually use weather instruments to detect subtle changes in climatic elements. I will measure temperature, wind speed, light levels, and humidity in order to understand where there are changes in the environment that our body can sense, and whether we can actually tell where these changes begin and end as a definition of space. So in my mind, the sensory transition that we experience marks edges that are actually spatial boundaries. And even though we may not see them and they may not be solid, they mark how we understand space.
Can you say a little bit about what attracted you to the Landscape Lab as a particular space or place for this kind of landscape research? And did the particular qualities of the lab's physical environment inform your research in any way?
Sure, yeah. Well, the lab is interesting in that it provides, a very unique opportunity to study how plants shape space. The way it's been composed with rooms that are consisting of single species, planted in grids, cultivated to a particular form. All this makes it easier to observe the effects that the decisions that we make as designers about species, about spacing and shape can have on the qualities of outdoor space.
So when you were there, I know it was your first visit, what you found, was that what you expected to find?
Honestly, when I do any field work, what I find is rarely what I initially expected. Quite often it's so much more than I expected. Part of field work is, sort of first getting a lay of the land and then adjusting your plans to accommodate what you're actually seeing. Mm-hmm. So in the labs, what was interesting is that the rigor of the planted form made it so much easier to sense or to understand how we perceive the interiority of outside space, right? How we actually feel enclosure. And my work, before coming to the lab, more often than not, has focused on how we understand space from a long distance view, right? So top down, looking from above, how do we define microclimatic space by understanding where are its edges, what is its shape, and what is its dimension? But the reality at the lab is that actually, because of the uniformity of the planting, because of the removal of the subcanopy and shrub and ground cover layers in many of the places, or many of the rooms in the lab, I could actually start to read the shape of the space while I was inside of it. And so what was interesting is that suddenly I could read the dimension of landscape space, while also understanding the quality of the space, what it feels like, and could compare these things at the same time. That's new in my research.
It strikes me in what you're saying that you're talking about having those two ways of knowing actually working at the same time. Maybe to push that a little bit further, do you see any specific kind of potential or special potential in the lab to contribute to landscape knowledge in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's quite rare in the landscape to be able to observe canopy spaces that are so rigorously defined. Even when planted form follows a defined system in design spaces, a line, a grid, etc. It's rare to be able to compare what changes as a result of changing plant species or how a plant is cultivated. And so I think, it's interesting. I think the lab can tell us quite a bit about these variables that we are working with when we shape space, particularly when we're working with vegetation, and the degree to which they impact our perception of the environments that we inhabit. I also think it gives us a way to understand what interiority is when it isn't defined by a building. I think this is actually something that's quite enigmatic in the landscape. It's interesting to think about this now we're all confined to our homes because of COVID-19. And we know that it's not the same as being outside. When we are outside, though, it's difficult to define what it is that creates a sense of enclosure when we're, finding a space to inhabit. So I think the lab has the potential to help us understand that because of the way it's curated.
I'm struck by your observation of all of us sitting in our little interiors, in thinking probably more intensively than we ever have about what it's like to be outside. Thinking forward to some moment in time, hopefully not too far away, where you're going to be able to come back to the Landscape Lab. Is there any particular thing you're imagining you would like to do when you get there a second time? I won't say if.
Now that I understand how the lab can help me study the interior qualities of space, not only what its shape and dimension is when it's defined by the things that we can feel, that we can sense, but also what are its qualities? How does it acquire thickness? Thickness is a word that we'll often use to talk about landscape space, but sort of in poetic ways without sort of a definitive characteristic that we can measure. I'd like to return so I can adjust the field techniques that I was using so that I can combine those two modes of observation, the external view and the internal view. And while I was there, I started to experiment a little bit with some of the photographs that I took at the lab to see if they could depict that thickness of space. And I'd love to return to produce these studies of different rooms to cross-compare how those qualities change as you move through the rooms that are curated with different species, different grid spacing, different cultivation of the plants. So we can see how that actually affects the quality of the space.
Well, we would really love to have you back soon and to not only host your studies in the lab, but also to get the full lecture that you were slated to give prior to COVID, where you can elaborate even more on these points. Thank you so much for joining.
Absolutely. I look forward to coming back, hopefully sometime sooner than later.